Looking at this passage this morning, I mentioned last week that chapter 2 gives us really further details about the creation of mankind. And in our passage today, we have a description of the creation of woman and the institution or the establishment of the institution of marriage. If you look at verse 18, for the first time in the creation account, God declares something as not good. And the Lord God said, "It is not good that man should be alone." If you remember from chapter 1, as we worked our way through the creation account, there were many occasions when God declared His creation good, and then on the sixth day of His creation, after He had created everything, God looked at it and declared it was very good. But now, God looks at man dwelling alone in the garden, and He says, that's not good. That's not good for man to be alone. Adam was in a perfect environment. He was in paradise. He was free from sin. He had a relationship with God. He had fellowship with God every day in the garden. And you would think Adam had everything that he needed for it to be good. And yet God declared that Adam was alone and that Adam's aloneness wasn't good. And so God created a wife for Adam. That was God's answer to Adam's aloneness. If you look down in verse 24 shows us that Adam and Eve's relationship is the foundation now for marriage. And so the instruction that we have here from Adam and Eve that God gives us is really instruction for all marriages. And so God created the woman. In verse 18, God describes Eve as a helper, comparable to Adam. And that word helper is a word that is often misunderstood and misconstrued by both men and women. And so we really want to just look at what this word means in the context of the Bible and get a biblical understanding of what God is saying here. And you have to remember that the culture defines words a certain way, and then God defines words a certain way. And quite often, the way that God defines a word is the opposite of the way the culture defines a word. So we want to look at what God means here by describing the woman as a helper comparable to Him. If you remember, first of all, back in chapter 1, that God created both male and female in His image. And He gave both male and female dominion over His creation. And God commanded both the male and female to be fruitful and multiply, and male and female together were to fill the earth, and together they were to subdue it. And so chapter 1 teaches equality between the sexes. Equality between the sexes. The male and female, as husband and wife, are equal in God's eyes. Both are made in God's image, both given dominion, both commanded to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. So a husband and wife are in a partnership together to serve the purposes of God. That's the purpose of my marriage. That's the purpose of your marriage if you're married. It's a partnership in a sense, a team, a husband and wife, who serve the purposes of God. And I believe that God has a purpose and plan for every marriage. He's got a plan for every husband and wife to fulfill. And so we see equality in chapter 1. Now we come to chapter 2. And what God does now in chapter 2 is God defines the different roles within the partnership, and He gives the husband the responsibility to lead the partnership with the counsel and help of the wife. That's why in chapter 3, when we get there, when the fall takes place, God seeks Adam about what happened. In chapter 3, verse 9, it says Then the Lord God called to Adam and said to him, Where are you? Where are you? God sought Adam, not Eve, because God designated Adam as the leader of the marriage. And so here in chapter 2, now God distinguishes the roles in the marriage, and these designations in the marriage have really nothing to do with ability or worth or status in the marriage. Again, in chapter 1, the man and woman are created equally in God's image. So it's simply a matter of function within the marriage. God establishes the husband as the leader, and the wife is to help the husband in fulfilling God's purposes for the marriage. But it has nothing to do with ability or capability or intelligence or anything else. And I can honestly say that my wife is better at most things than me. She's more competent, she's more capable, she's smarter than me at just about everything. And I think most men can say the same thing about their own wife. Or maybe not say it, they think it at least. But my point is that God ordained the husband to lead the family in pursuing God's will for his family with the help of the wife, not because the husband is a better leader. Now, this word helper here, again, it has a negative connotation in our culture today. To many, describing the wife as a helper makes her sound inferior or less than the husband. But this word helper, it in no way implies an inferior role for the wife. In fact, get this, throughout the Bible, this word helper is most often used to describe God himself. God is described over and over in the Bible as our helper. In Psalm 121, I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Psalm 46, verse 1, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Hebrews 13:6, the Lord is my helper. Psalm 33, God is our help and our shield. God is described as the helper. And when we read in the Bible all these verses about God being our helper, we in no way think of God as somehow inferior to man, or that God is less than, or that God is less important or of lower position because he's our helper. No, in fact, we rejoice, right, that God is our helper. We are thankful that God condescends to our level to help us and to lift us up because we desperately need God's help. And when God helps his people, he retains his deity, he retains his glory, he retains his majesty. He doesn't lose his worth by stepping into the role of helper. And neither does a wife. A wife doesn't lose her worth by stepping into the role of a helper in the marriage relationship. Biblically, by being a helper, a wife is displaying the character and nature of God. A wife does exactly what God does by being a helper. And let me say to the husbands that are listening, husbands, the reason that God gave you a wife in part is because you need help. We need help. God knew that we needed help, and so he gave us a wife. God knows we aren't capable of fulfilling his purpose for our lives, and so God gave us a wife to help us because we needed help. And so we should be thankful for our wife and the help that she provides. He describes the woman as a helper comparable to him. And this word comparable here, it's an interesting word. First of all, it implies equality. Equality. So the wife is both helper and equal to the husband. And it can be defined a couple different ways. It can mean a helper suitable for him, compatible to him, or corresponding to him. In other words, when God brings two people together in marriage, a husband and wife, they are designed by God to perfectly suit each other, corresponding to each other's needs, fulfilling what is lacking in the other person, working together as a team. Or to use a cliche from an old movie, they complete each other. You complete me physically, emotionally, spiritually, by God's design. God brings a man and a woman together as husband and wife, and that wife is perfectly suited, perfectly designed for the husband, and the husband perfectly designed for his wife.